This week in wrestling history, 28 years ago this week on March 9th, 1993, it's the small things that puts a smile on my face. We could talk about all the big events in wrestling history, and we will. But nothing puts a smile on my face like the Toxic Turtles, who made their one and only WWE appearance at the Wrestling Challenge tapings on this date in Augusta, Georgia. Timmy and Tommy Turtle, portrayed by Barry Hardy and Gillberg himself, Dwayne Gill. You can find this match on the WWE Unreleased Matches 1986 to 1995 DVD that I reviewed on the YouTube channel actually years ago. Hardy and Gill were very often used as enhancement talent. I mean, I can remember as a younger fan, Barry Hardy would have a lot of singles matches. Dwayne Gill was always around, at least in the early 90s he was. So I think if you grew up watching those old syndicated shows, you definitely saw them lose their fair share of matches. You've definitely heard of those two names before. These guys would do anything to get noticed. And they had these two Ninja Turtle knockoff costumes made to take with them wherever they went. TV tapings, independent shows, because you just never know, I guess, when the Shredder and his foot soldiers may attack. So you got to bring your turtle costumes around with you wherever you go. These were so clearly Raphael and Donatello knockoffs. If these ever made television, WWE would have been sued into oblivion. Actually, they probably would have just gotten a cease and desist. But these never would have made TV. Dwayne Gill told this story in an interview on WWE.com. He would wear the costume very often in the locker room, and he would dance around like a fool to pop the boys. He wanted to just entertain people in the locker room. And one day he's doing this, and he looks up, and who does he see in front of him? But he sees Vince McMahon standing there. And Vince McMahon goes, "Who the hell is inside that thing?" And Dwayne Gill takes the mask, he takes the head off, and Vince just goes, "I should have known. You got another one of those?" And Gillberg says, "Yup." "Well, put him on, because you're wrestling in 10 minutes. And that's how the match came to be. Instead of the Ninja Turtles, they came out as the Toxic Turtles. The absolute best part of this match is when Donatello goes for a cover, and the opponent kicks out. And Donatello lands on his back. He lands on his shell. And he can't move. All he can do is flail around. He's flailing his arms and his legs around because he's on his shell. He's stuck. He can't move. And Raphael had to come into the ring and grab him and just roll him over. I thought that was fantastic. The people did not think that this was fantastic. The people in the audience that night, they turned on this match something fierce. They started booing. Gillberg says that when he got to the back, Vince was laughing his ass off. He loved the entire thing. But sadly, that was the end of the Toxic Turtles. I'm pretty sure that was the only appearance they ever made at any of these TV tapings, and they never actually did make TV. But it's nice to know that WWE did Chikara before Chikara ever did Chikara. 25 years ago this week, on the March 11th, 1996 episode of Monday Night Raw, the Ringmaster was the Ringmaster no more. In his place was Stone Cold Steve Austin, using that name for the very first time in a match against Savio Vega. 24 years ago this week, on March 10th, 1997, the day after Biggie Smalls was shot and killed, it was the debut of the new Raw is War format and the dawning of a new era that really is still with us to this very day. Raw has largely retained the same basic look for its show ever since. This is the first Raw that we got the giant Titantron, we got the rampway to the ring, we had a new intro, we had new theme music, The Beautiful People by Marilyn Manson, which, due to some kind of rights issue, I guess, it did not last very long. I think they had the music for about 2 or 3 weeks, and that was pretty much the end of it. They switched over to the Thorn in Your Eye for Hour 1, that song from the WWF Full Metal, the album, Volume 1, right? They had that for hour 1, and they used the We're All Together song for hour 2, because they broke the show up into 2 shows, something for Nielsen ratings purposes. Hour 1, I think, was Raw, and hour 2 became Warzone. I think that's how it worked. But yeah, some people may not be aware that Raw used the Beautiful People years before SmackDown ever did. But the show featured a main event of Psycho Sid and The Undertaker against Vader and Mankind. It featured The Undertaker doing a giant dive out over the top rope onto the heels, wiping out all of the heels on the floor. Probably the first instance of Undertaker doing this dive that I can remember. Now, I know he did it at the Ground Zero pay-per-view later on that year, and he obviously did it many more times over the years in the Inferno match with Kane, right? He jumped over the flames out of the ring, and it became a staple in a lot of his WrestleMania matches in later years. I'm just trying to think of if there was ever a time I saw him do that top rope dive out of the ring before this, and I can't think of any. This might have been the first time that I've ever seen him do that before. And it happened here on this show. It also featured one of the more memorable segments in Raw history, the Great Debate between Jerry the King Lawler and Paul Heyman, accompanied by an entourage of ECW talent. ECW had a very big presence on Raw weeks earlier at the Manhattan Center, and Lawler was working an angle where he hated ECW. I don't think it was much of an angle, really. Not that I didn't like it, just that I don't think he was really doing too much acting. I really don't think he liked a lot of those ECW people. He definitely had no love lost with Paul Heyman. Controlled animosity is how Jim Ross described it between the two of them on his Grilling JR podcast. Lawler admitted years ago on one of those Legends Roundtable shows that WWE did on the old 24/7 service before the network launched, that he broke Paul Heyman's jaw on purpose years ago. I think it was in 1987 in Memphis. They worked together. Now, my understanding of the story, and I could have the details twisted here, but my understanding is that Heyman was in Memphis. They had plans to work a scaffold match. I don't know who else would have been involved, unless it's possible maybe it was just going to be Lawler against Heyman. But whatever the angle was, the night of the first match, Heyman refused to climb up the scaffold because he said he was afraid of heights. And I don't know how they got around it that night, but they did. And they got the match done. And I think they actually may have taken the match to different towns. They may have taken it on a loop around different towns in the area down there. And on the very last night, before they were to have that final match on that loop, I guess, Lawler punched Heyman right in the mouth. And he broke his jaw on purpose. And Heyman told the website UGO.com back in 2008 that Lawler broke his jaw before the match, and that he has always taken liberties with other people, especially those who, by the nature of the situation, had to place some kind of trust in him. Fuck him. I don't spend any time in my life thinking about him. He is in the past where he belongs. And no, I am not surprised he is still talking about me. If half his locker room banged my wife, I guess I would hold a grudge too. Yowie wowie. Those are some stinging comments there from Paul Heyman. So yeah, I would say there's always been some heat there between the two of them. I think it's safe to say. But if working with Lawler is what it would take to promote ECW's first pay-per-view the following month, then so be it. And Paul Heyman was more than happy to come and do it. The Great Debate had Lawler and Heyman at a podium in the ring. Jim Ross was the moderator, and Lawler kept insulting them and saying the WWE sells out the Philadelphia Spectrum every time they run there, 20,000 people, while ECW brags about filling up a bingo hall with 1,100 people every month. And as Lawler is talking, you can see the Dudley Boys and Tommy Dreamer and the Sandman and the Eliminators, all these ECW guys standing around behind Heyman, just like salivating and chomping at the bit, just waiting to get their hands on this guy and just kill him. And then he and Heyman start shooting on each other, and Lawler says Heyman must be a little light in the loafers, since all he wants to do is hang out with all these ECW guys, he can never be a real athlete himself. And that's why he hangs around other athletes. And Heyman came back with a crack about Lawler's taste in, shall we say, younger women. So it all breaks down in the end, and Lawler realizes he's in trouble. And he warns, don't make me call back there to my friends. I got people in the back ready to come out and help me. And of course, he calls to the back, and nobody comes out to his defense, so he just bails out of the ring, and that was the end of the segment. Psycho Sid defeated Bret Hart in a steel cage dark match, which they had been doing for days at a lot of the live events before this, all with the same finish of Sid escaping the cage as Bret Hart is trying to climb out over the top. A week after this is when they did the match on television, and it led to one of my all-time favorite segments in Raw history, which I get to talk about next week. 22 years ago this week, on March 8th, 1999, it was the great Kevin Nash experiment on a 3-hour edition of WCW Monday Nitro. Nash had become the head booker for the month, actually I think it was the month before. He became the head booker in WCW, and on this night, we were a mere 6 days away from their uncensored pay-per-view. Here is an excerpt from the Death of WCW book by Brian Alvarez and R.D. Reynolds. Nash's first move was to present a Nitro that featured no wrestling in the first hour. None. Not a single solitary match. You might recall that Nitro was a wrestling show. Apparently, Nash thought that wrestling on this wrestling show was unnecessary, and he booked the show like this to prove that they could draw the same rating if they had 0 matches in the first hour as they would if there were 10. And the thing about it is, Nash largely turned out to be right, although they still got crushed by WWE. I mean, it was they were getting slaughtered at that point left and right. Nitro did a 4.4 rating, which was pretty much in line with what they had been doing before that. So around that time, they were pretty much doing the same numbers. Raw scored a full 2 ratings points higher with a 6.4. The Ric Flair Bill Goldberg main event did a 4.6 final quarter and a 5.7 overrun, while over on Raw, Stone Cold against Mankind did a 6 rating. The finish of both shows combined for a rating of nearly 12 and a combined share of more than 21, which is just astonishing. Anybody who knows anything about ratings and share and all that, think about that. On cable, no less. On cable, a 12 rating and a 21 share combined for pro wrestling on a Monday night in 1999. And that just gives you a snapshot of how absolutely gigantic pro wrestling was at that time. We never even saw the inside of the building in the first 60 minutes of that Nitro show, and the people who bought tickets paid to watch this shit on a screen. So if I were in the building that night, I wouldn't be very happy about that. But we were treated to segments like a Nitro party out in Rhode Island, with Conan, Kidman, and the Nitro girls partying with a bunch of college kids. It literally looked like a giant frat party. And the wrestlers just so happened to be there with drinks in their hands, being interviewed by, what was that guy? DJ Ran, whatever the guy's name was. They had brought this DJ guy in to host a lot of the Nitro parties at that time. So that was one of the segments. In another segment, we had Scott Steiner and Buff Bagwell being pulled over by the cops in Boston while driving a Hummer limo. And Steiner was in the driver's seat, so you got to picture this. This long Hummer limo pulled over on the side of the road, and there's Big Papa Pump in the driver's seat. And the cops recognized, they told him to get out of the car. The cops recognized who they were, and they ended up deputizing them as cops so that they can help them fight crime. Because that's what the cops do. If they pull you over and they go, hey, I know who you are, I'll tell you what, I'm going to make you an honorary cop. And you're going to help me hunt the bad guys. Because of course, that's how it works. But the main entree of all of these segments was Torrie Wilson for whatever reason, is at a gun range, firing a gun. She's shooting at the range when she is interrupted by Hollywood Hogan and Kevin Nash. They have arrived at the shooting range. They've asked the front desk person, is Tori Wilson here? Oh, yeah, she's inside. Okay, and they go walking in. And this was a scene right out of a bad porno movie. Although I've always wondered, when I hear that expression, are there good porno movies? I don't know that there's such a thing as a good porno or a bad porno. No one's really watching it for the acting, I wouldn't think. Anyway, they make dinner plans for later in the night, where we later find Hogan and Nash. They are dining the beautiful Miss Wilson. There is a camera here showing their dinner. And they are plotting. They are plotting to take down Ric Flair, who Hulk Hogan is facing at the pay-per-view. Oh, by the way, there's a pay-per-view that Sunday with a Hulk Hogan-Ric Flair main event. So keep that in mind. So they are plotting ways that they could take down the Nature Boy in advance of this big pay-per-view main event that's coming up. What do we do about the kid? Says Hogan. The kid being Ric Flair's son, David, who Tori was involved with on camera at that time. What do we do about the kid? And Tori talks about how she has this really, really hot friend. I mean, like, really hot, who they're apparently waiting on. They're waiting on this woman to show up. And Hogan says, well, you know, if you're a 10, well, how hot is your friend? And Tori says, oh, my friend is a 12. And Hogan can't believe it. He can't believe that's even possible. So the friend eventually shows up, and of course she's going by the name Mrs. Robinson, because of course she is. Eventually she shows up, and Hogan is just fawning over her. And Nash promises the woman... All of this really happened, by the way. I just rewatched it the other day. This all really happened. Nash promises the woman $20,000 to sleep with David Flair. And she only gets the money when the job is done. I don't think we got an actual match. And of course the job, you can figure out what the job is. I don't think we got an actual match until 15 minutes after the second hour. Once they finally did make it back into the arena, they immediately started with what else? An interview segment. So I don't think we actually got a match until probably 9:10 or 9:15 or something that night. And it was Raven against Hack. So two former ECW guys going one-on-one was the first match of the night, almost midway into the show, here in what I call the great Kevin Nash experiment. There really is no one quite like Kevin Nash. 11 years ago this week, on March 8th, 2010, the new Monday Night War began with a whimper for Impact Wrestling opposite Monday Night Raw. This was their big first full-time night head-to-head with WWE after their big January 4th show where they peaked with over 2 million viewers at one point. They did so well that Spike TV decided to move them on a permanent basis to Monday nights. The big hook for this show were the in-ring debuts, the in-ring returns of Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair. This was Hogan's first televised match since his win over Randy Orton at SummerSlam back in 2006, 4 years before this. And this was Flair's first televised match since his retirement match. I can't even say that with a straight face. His retirement match with Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania 24. Both these guys had already had other matches off television. They even wrestled each other. They had this big tour of Australia, which was so sad to watch. If you go back and look up photos of that, I mean, they look like they're fucking 90 years old, bleeding all over the place. It's disgusting. But this was their first matches on TV in quite a while. Hogan tagged with the Monster Abyss in a win over Flair and AJ Styles, and Rob Van Dam made his TNA debut as a surprise opponent for Sting, pinning Sting in just 10 seconds. For all their efforts, TNA was soundly destroyed. They weren't just beaten. They were beaten and bloodied and murdered and brought back to life and then beaten again by WWE to the tune of a 3.4 Nielsen rating for Raw to TNA's 0.98. And the salt in the wound is that their Thursday replay of the show actually did a better number than their live airing did. 19 years ago this week, on March 11th, 2002, Monday Night Raw aired live from the Joe in Detroit with a mega main event, pitting Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock against all three members of the NWO who had just debuted in the company the month before, Hulk Hogan, Scott Hall, and Kevin Nash. Just 6 days before WrestleMania 18, Hogan pinned The Rock with a leg drop, the only time he would pin The Rock in his career. And it was the one and only time that Hulk Hogan and Stone Cold Steve Austin shared a ring on opposite sides against each other in an actual match. They even mixed it up. At one point, they tagged in together, and it just, you know, when I watch that back, it's like, this should have been this big momentous moment. And there were people in the crowd who definitely popped when they both tagged in together, but boy, this should have been such a bigger moment than it was. But it was the only time they ever worked against each other in a match. And what a match it was to just give away on free TV. 18 years ago this week on March 11th, 2003, at the Smackdown taping in his hometown of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Kurt Angle successfully defended his WWE Championship against Brock Lesnar. Yes, weeks before their main event at WrestleMania 19, WWE promoted a title match between Kurt Angle and Brock Lesnar on SmackDown. And so you may be wondering, well, why? Why would they do this? Why would they give away their WrestleMania main event early like that, just weeks before the show? Because Kurt Angle's neck was broken. I mean, I know, the sky is blue, water is wet, grass is green, and Kurt Angle has a broken freaking neck. But Kurt Angle's neck was all jacked up. He needed surgery. And the plan was for him to drop the title to Lesnar on TV, and Brock would then instead defend against a different opponent at WrestleMania 19, that opponent being Chris Benoit. Kurt Angle had an MRI done on his neck a week before this. Plans were made for him to have neck surgery with Dr. Lloyd Youngblood out of San Antonio, the same doctor who operated on Steve Austin's neck and Benoit's neck, Edge, Rhino, Lita. A whole host of other WWE stars went to Dr. Youngblood for that spinal fusion surgery. And it would have kept Angle out of the ring for at least a year, possibly would have ended his career. That was Dr. Youngblood's recommendation in a memo that he sent to the, powers that be in WWE. His recommendation was that Kurt never wrestle again. His neck was that bad. He recommended that he never wrestle another match again. And what the good doctor wanted to do, he wanted to fuse 4 of Angle's vertebrae, which would have been it for him. If you have 4 of them fused, you're done. That's it. There's no more wrestling ever again. And surgery was scheduled for St. Patrick's Day, March 17th, and plans were in motion for a title change here at the tapings until Angle went to Vince McMahon the day before. The day before the taping, Kurt went to Vince and he pled with him. He asked him permission, please let me wrestle at WrestleMania. Let's do the match. Let me go in there against Brock. I'll put him over. I'll drop the title. I'll do the job, and then I'll go on and I'll have my surgery. And he talked to Vince about it. He talked to Brock about it. He talked to Benoit. Because he would be taking that opportunity away from Chris Benoit. Chris Benoit was going to get a huge spot here on the WrestleMania card, and Kurt went to him as well to kind of tell him, okay, here's what I'm thinking. I'm sorry, but I really want to keep this match. And so instead, what they ended up doing here, because they had already announced the match, they did a very quick match where Kurt Angle came to the ring. He went into the corner. He was kneeling down in the corner like he was saying a prayer. And when the camera shifted over to Brock during his entrance, they swapped Kurt out for his brother, Eric Angle, who was dressed exactly like Kurt Angle, wearing the same singlet, the same red hoodie that Angle had come out wearing. And so Brock comes into the ring. He starts beating the hell out of who he thought was Kurt, hits him with an F5, and when he goes for the pin, he stops and gets up and he realizes, wait a minute, that's not Kurt. Meanwhile, Shelton Benjamin and Charlie Haas, they were members of Team Angle. They show up in the aisleway. They provide the distraction. So Brock now is distracted by the two of them. And in the time that Brock and the referee are distracted, Kurt rolls back into the ring and he rolls his brother out, and he lays there. And when Brock Lesnar turns around and goes to pick him up, Angle cradles him for the win, and he retains the title. This was Brock Lesnar's first non-pay-per-view television loss. And in the end, instead of going with Dr. Youngblood for the operation, who, like I said, Dr. Youngblood was of the opinion that this man should never wrestle again. I want to fuse 4 of his vertebrae in his neck because his neck is that bad. Kurt obviously didn't like that, and he wanted a second opinion. There was another doctor who did neck surgery on some wrestlers, including Scott Hall. And Kurt made the decision instead to go with Dr. Hae-Dong Jo out of his hometown of Pittsburgh. And instead of fusing 4 vertebrae in his neck and ending his career, he elected to have only 2 of his vertebrae fused. It was a minimally invasive procedure that would have had him back in the ring within 4 to 6 weeks. Now think about that. How do you go from having one doctor who clearly is an expert in this and has done this operation on many wrestlers before, who looks at your scans and your tests and your neck and says, boy, your neck is so bad, I would recommend you never set foot in a ring again, and I want to fuse 4 of your vertebrae, you're probably going to be recovering for over a year. How do you go from that to having a minimally invasive procedure that puts you back in the ring in 4 to 6 weeks? Well, you can do it because it's only a stopgap. It's not going to fix the problem. It's only going to get you back in the ring a little bit faster, but you're going to end up needing neck surgery anyway. But that's what Kurt wanted. That's what he elected to do. And look, Kurt was back in the ring by June. By the end of the year, all it took was one vicious chair shot to the top of his head by Brock Lesnar to undo the entire surgery. And he broke his neck again. I don't even know how the man's head stays secured to his neck with all the damage that's been done to it over the years. Have you seen Kurt Angle's neck? It really stood out to me when he dressed up that one time on TV a few years ago. There was a battle royal, I think, on TV. And this was before his retirement match with Baron Corbin at WrestleMania. But he dressed up as the Conquistador in that gold costume. And he could barely get the mask on. You could tell because it didn't come down to cover his neck. So I knew exactly who was under the mask right away. I mean, all you had to do was look at his neck. I've never seen a neck like that in my life. All that swelling. Kurt Angle has the fattest neck that I have ever seen in my entire life. So all I did was look at the back of the guy's head. I said, oh, that's Kurt Angle. But just think of the abuse and the suplexes and the bumps and everything that this guy has taken to the neck, all because when he broke it in the Olympics, he never had it fixed. Had he had it fixed, who knows? It would have prolonged his career maybe even longer. I mean, now he's got other issues. He's got atrophy in his arms. He's got knee problems. He'll always have the neck problems. But he's broken his neck about 4 or 5 different times, which is why it's probably looks so swollen. But yeah, it's crazy to think about that the plan had been hatched for him to drop the belt on TV. It was going to be Lesnar and Benoit as our WrestleMania 19 main event, but Angle pled his case to Vince McMahon and begged and pleaded, and he got him to change his mind.